The first session of the 2024 Ohio State University Extension Beef Team's virtual beef school was hosted via Zoom on January 18th. This year's 4 evening beef school sessions are taking a deep dive into production practices and factors that impact quality and profitability when it comes to producing beef to be marketed directly to consumers. This first session was focused on genetic selection and planned calving to better meet the demands for locally grown and marketed beef. Featured speakers for the evening included Gahler, OSU Extension Educator in Sandusky County, and Dean Kreager, OSU Extension Educator in Licking County. Listen as Ohio State University Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff introduces the evening's program and first speaker.
All right, everybody, I've got 6 o'clock. Appreciate everybody for logging in and joining us for night 1 of our winter beef webinar series. This winter kind of have a more of a focused approach. I'm going to hone in on producing local beef and meeting some of that local demand across the state. I'm Garth Ruff, beef cattle field specialist for OSU Extension. We've got a great panel of speakers, I think, here for the next 4 webinars, January through April. With that, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our first speaker tonight, Alan Gahler, our extension educator for Ag and Natural Resources in Sandusky County. We're going to start with genetic selection and hopefully work our way on through the beef production process. So Al, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Garth. So I don't know if I got the easy slot or not going first, but to me, this talk is geared basically towards cow-calf side of things. And Dean and I talked about that this afternoon, that both of us have the task of kind of from the beginning, which we realize some of you guys may not necessarily be in cow-calf production, but some of this will equate to some things that hopefully you can utilize in your herds as well, whether you're going out and buying those calves and have good relationships with the sources of where you're picking up calves to use to feed for local beef. But the easy part for me on that is a lot of this really doesn't have anything really too specifically special for raising those calves for local beef. If we're a cow-calf producer, we should be wanting to do the best job we can to accomplish our goals and to help our bottom line all the way through. But there might be a few specifics that we look at that we'll talk about with some of the genetic selection and some of the tools at our disposal that might gear us a little bit more towards animals that we're going to intend to put in our freezer or our neighbor's freezer or direct to any consumer. First thing with that, just like in normal cow-calf production, and I could seriously just talk here for quite a few minutes and stop this presentation after one slide, which is why I kind of jokingly put the questions comment right there. But we need to start out with good bulls, and we'll get into talking about artificial insemination, use of EPDs, and some other selection criteria. But regardless of whether those are AI bulls or our cleanup bulls, or if we are not using AI at all and we are doing all natural service, good bull selection has to be at the forefront of our scenario, regardless of what the endpoint is and what our marketing strategy is for our calves. And I've heard many different variations of this quote here on the first line over the years, but joked about this all the way back in judging team in college, always talking about seed stock sales and club calf sales and so forth. And just keep in mind, price does not establish quality. Price simply establishes ownership. And we can read a lot into that because 2 people can like one animal, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best animal just because they continue to bid at an auction and run that price up. But at the same time, and this can be very true of bull sales throughout Ohio and all across the country, a lot of times we do get what we pay for. So we need to stop and think about that, because as the next slide's going to show you, that selection of your bulls is the biggest impact you can have on your herd. I know, especially in the seed stock world or the show side of things, having the right cow to try to produce what we can make marketable animals out of does have a big factor. But in this situation, especially looking at whether it's commercial cow-calf production or towards freezer beef production, utilizing good bulls and the influence they're going to have on our herd is such a big part of that we have really got to make that at the forefront of our decision-making process. And keep in mind, especially if you're 100% natural service, 50% of the genetics into your herd are from that bull. And if you're going to keep replacement females, regardless of what we're doing with them, there's a huge impact there. So when we're selecting those bulls, we need to go out and source them from reputable breeders. And I don't mean to pick on the commercial cow-calf guy in Ohio, but I've seen this over and over throughout the years in my career where producers go out and buy the first $1,500 bull that they can find from the closest farm, so they don't have to run all over the place and search for that bull. And then it leads to problems, whether it's foot and leg problems, whether it's a semen problem, whether it's a longevity problem. They're not getting good growth out of the calves. Sourcing that bull from a reputable breeder and not just simply finding that intact male from somewhere close to home because it was convenient and easy and he sure looks like a good bull. We need to do our homework on this, and there is no bigger or better investment we can make on our farm than that bull. Making sure that at the time of purchase, that bull is semen tested so that he's a proven breeder, vaccinated. We've analyzed him for phenotype with good feet and legs. And if you're buying a bull that is from a purebred producer that has EPDs, absolutely utilize that information. And as I said, we'll get into a little bit more on that here in the next few slides and how we can use those EPDs to help us in selection for producing local beef. So what does matter the most when it comes to selecting your genetics? Well, a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different goals can have a big influence on that. First and foremost is, why are you raising cattle? Have you always raised cattle to try to produce local beef? Or have you just always had cattle because grandpa had cattle and dad had cattle and it's just a way of life and we need to have cattle and don't really have a marketing strategy? How you answer that question can have a big impact on how you utilize the rest of the data that not only I'm going to provide tonight, but what Dean and Garth and all the rest of our speakers throughout the series are going to tell you. So need to answer that question for yourself and really stop and think about that and what that impact has on your life and what impact that's going to have on most of these questions here. What cattle do you plan to market from your herd, and when do you want to market them? Obviously with the focus of our webinar series this year, talking about local beef, we're gearing our talks towards those people that are direct marketing finished animals off of their farm. But we can direct market calves to someone else who's going to feed those for local freezer beef. We can direct market replacement females for people who are going to try to raise calves for freezer beef. So figuring out what that plan is and what percentage of the herd, because depending on our herd size, we may not be able to market all of our calves as freezer beef. We might have to have other avenues or outlets for them. So knowing what our plan is going to be to market those cattle can help put things together from a backward standpoint that, Dean and Garth are going to get into some more of the stuff along that line, but some really important things to consider. This next one in here, again, kind of in joking, but, what is your wife or daughter's favorite color? And I'm sure, Stan, you're probably chuckling as you sit here thinking about some of the times that we had discussions like this with Dr. Fluharty and John Grimes talking about cattle at these meetings over the years, and how many decisions do we make based on what was our daughter's favorite calf in the herd, what 4-H project did that we probably shouldn't have because the genetics were not the best. And what cow is our wife's favorite one that we cannot get rid of even when she doesn't have a calf. And a lot of this is sometimes hard to force ourselves to make that decision, but things that we need to think about if we're really looking at genetic selection to improve not only the profitability, but the quality of our herd and ultimately the quality of the beef product that we're going to produce. Next, what are your production goals? What percentage calf crop do you want to have? What weaning weights do you want to have? Or if you're not in cow-calf production, what is your goal for rate per day of gain on the calves that you're feeding for local beef? What is your goal for carcass quality? And then ultimately, all that leads to helping you meet your financial goals. I would guess that most of you do not want to be in the freezer beef production if you're not doing it to try to make some money. A lot of us just simply love being in the cattle business, and even in years when we don't, we're going to continue to be in it, but we need to set some financial goals, and then that we can work backwards from as well to help us have an impact on what we can do in terms of genetic selection. And then I hope you all understand and know the term hybrid vigor. I'm not going to have time to get into a lot in detail on every facet that we could talk about tonight for genetic selection, but hybrid vigor certainly is one of those things that we can take advantage of with a crossbreeding program to try to bring that added growth or that added carcass quality or specific traits that we need to improve within our herd along the line. So some different topics that we'll work through here in the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to get into those EPDs and look at that and help hopefully give you at least a basic understanding of how to read into some of those and what ones are the most important to look for our particular situation we're discussing tonight. Are there breeds that we should ultimately be using? Are there breeds that we should avoid? What are some of the advantages? What's our replacement heifer strategy? Are we keeping them ourselves? How many do we need to keep back to keep our herd going? What's our marketing strategy for those calves that we are going to finish out? Or what about the ones that we're not going to finish out? How does that impact our selection? And then, of course, that's going to lead us to a breeding plan, and Dean's going to talk a lot more about that. We also need to consider our feed resources when it comes to our genetic selection. We may not be able to, under some circumstances with available feed, express the full genetic potential of selections that we would want to make. So we need to hopefully have an understanding of how those two things can work together. And then ultimately, to me, it always comes back to the bottom line. We need to, as producers, be cognizant of the financial side of things. And if we're making decisions more so with our heart than with our head, sometimes that doesn't always equate to making it in a profitable situation. And the longer we continue like that, the shorter time we'll probably find ourselves being able to be in business. As we start looking at those selection traits, what do we want to market? If we are selling freezer beef to local, whether it's extremely local or whether we're reaching out into a regional area, what do you want to be known for? Why are people going to come back to you? A lot of times that's the quality of that beef, which has a direct relationship sometimes with the quality grade of that beef on that USDA grading system. And marbling can have a big effect with that. And that is a trait that we can select for if we have capabilities of utilizing animals with EPDs. But if we're simply going to look at trying to improve that, this hierarchy right here in general terms in the cattle industry is going to give us the most marbling within those breeds. And I'm not suggesting that we go out and start breeding our beef cows to Jersey or Holstein bulls, but there are cases out there where that has worked, and some interesting research projects that I've been aware of and been a part of over my career, where we've seen, a quarter blood Jersey bred into an Angus herd or a quarter blood Holstein bred into something else to try to take advantage of some of those carcass characteristics. We can do that within beef breeds, but there is some merit sometimes for some of that crossbreeding situation. Are we producing grain-fed freezer beef, or are we trying to find a niche market, and are we making grass-fed beef? That can have an impact on our genetic selection, not only what breeds we might choose, but what traits we might select within those breeds. And what about carcass size? For the last couple of years, we cannot seem to make these animals big enough to satisfy the packers and the live auction markets around the state and around the country. And all of a sudden, instead of 12 or 13 or 1,400 pound animals, we're sending 16, 17, and 1,800 pound animals to slaughter. And the industry is accepting of that. Is that realistic for us for a local freezer beef option? In most cases, probably not. So something we want to think about with that genetic selection as well. Not only the specific genetics of within a breed, but what breeds we might be utilizing. If we're not finishing those calves ourselves, what do we need to be at in terms of weaning weight or yearling weight if we're going to market those cattle, and how important are those traits to our selection scenarios? And then on the flip side of things, what beef traits might we be falling short on that actually matter? If we're trying to just figure out uh, what things are going to have the biggest impact for us, I've got in this world of social media with hashtags everywhere, I put that one in there. What are the main reasons you call cows? That right there is going to tell you one of the quickest answers to some of the beef traits that you might be falling short on that actually matter. Directly related to the production of freezer beef may or may not matter. If it's an economic important trait to your herd and the overall profitability, going back to figure out what reasons you calling those cows could have an impact on the selections you want to make in terms of buying a bull or picking bulls for AI or bringing females back into the herd. Ultimately, a lot of times that comes down to pregnancy. We preg check those cows at the end of breeding season, and that's one of all criteria in a normal setting is cows that are open go down the road. But as we stop and think about what are the reasons that that cow might be open, is it because she is a cow that has too much milk production for our current situation with feed resources and she's working too hard on that calf and she can't bring herself back into flesh, therefore she doesn't breed as quickly? So does it have anything to do with feed efficiency? Does it have anything to do with any other measurable trace that we can look at and lead back to why that cow is open, that then could be a place where we need to look for selective improvement through our genetics? Are we calling that cow because of feet and legs? Are we calling that cow because of udder? Are we calling that cow because of disposition? A lot of those things that have that effect on why that cow is culled from the herd can also have a direct correlation to what we are doing in terms of producing freezer beef or calves that someone else is going to produce freezer beef from that can have an ultimate impact on their success. What other selection traits do we need to look at? A lot of different options out there, especially when you get a look at an EPD sheet in front of you, but birth weight and calving ease. And to me, over my career, this is the number one thing that we've talked about with commercial cow-calf producers. They just want to buy a bull that is low birth and high calving ease because they just don't want to have to check them during the night, and they want to make sure that calves are born alive. That is great that we have that concern, but in some cases, we may be giving up some advantages in other areas by selecting too hard for one specific trait, but it's something that we do ultimately need to keep in the back of our mind. Milk production, I mentioned that already, that a lot of producers may or may not understand the milk EPD within some of the most popular breeds that we have, and that a higher number is not always necessarily the best. We need to look more so at breed average and compare to what we have available for our feed resources, because in order for that cow to express her genetic for that milk production, she's got to be very well fed. So buying a bull that is at the very top of the breed in rankings for milk production might not always be the most profitable scenario for us, and that could lead to one of those not quite as easily fleshing animals that we keep back in our herd. We can discuss more on that as we get one of these EPD charts up here in another slide or two. Scrotal or other reproductive measurements, should that have a big impact if we are just simply keeping calves to race for freezer beef? Probably not, but that can have an influence on reproductive success herd. And if we are not keeping females back that are going to be highly reproductive, then we're costing ourselves on our bottom line, and we're not going to have as many calves born alive or as many calves to wean. So we're not going to have as many calves to market. So we do need to keep at least a little bit of an eye on those reproductive measurements as well. And, I already mentioned this once in talking about the daughter's 4-H project that may or may not have a spotted or speckled or chromed up hide that we have to keep in the herd forever. But does hide color matter? Does it matter to your consumer is probably what the ultimate question is that you need to ask yourself. Do you have freezer beef consumers who are expecting to come to you to buy what they think is Angus beef? Obviously, you're probably not going to be able to sell anything off the farm in any certified program without jumping through a bunch of hoops and hurdles. But if you have consumers that are coming to the farm to establish those relationships, that want to see where their animals come from and maybe even see those animals live, there's perceptions out there. Not to say that there is bad with not having a black hide, but some consumers have that stereotype. You need to educate yourself and be able to talk through with them why you have black-hided cows or why you don't have black-hided cows, what some of those differences are. And if that is going to have an impact on your direct marketing, might be something to think about in terms of your genetic selection. And then one that may or may not be at the top of everybody's list, but certainly should be, is phenotype. I already hit a little bit on feet and legs, but there's a lot to be said for phenotypic selection. We need to be looking at the physical stature and structure of those animals so that we know we're going to get ones that can have a long, productive life within the herd, that are going to produce calves that can be raised on concrete, can be raised in mud, can be raised on dirt, and have the structure to survive, to grow to the proper size that we want, and do it in an efficient manner. And phenotype is a very, very big part of that we need to match with our genetic selection. So the next 3 slides I've got are going to show some examples of bulls, and these are Angus EPDs. And I purposely pulled Angus not only because it's the most prevalent in terms of the use of the EPDs, and we have more Angus cows out there probably than any other breed, but we also have those as the standard for a crossbreed EPD comparisons. And we'll get to that in a few slides after we look at a couple different bulls here. But if we're going to select a bull from, in this example, a purebred Angus producer, and we know that our marketing goal is to produce freezer beef or to market calves to be sold to local feeders for freezer beef production, there's some traits that are probably going to be a little bit more economically important for us to look at than others. One of the things we probably want to look at are those carcass numbers, but we can get hung up on these sometimes and maybe do a little bit too much selection for 1 or 2 specific traits. And more on that in a couple of slides when I show you another bull. But this is just a good example. And for everyone to get a good understanding of how to read these, of course, across the top line here, you've got the actual EPD. So we've got Calving direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, ratio for average daily gain, dry matter intake, yearling height. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. But on the next line, under the carcass heading, we've got carcass weight, marbling, ribeye, fat, and then the numbers that below this are the actual EPD themselves is the first line. The second line is the accuracy of that EPD, and that number goes up over time as more data is turned in on these bulls. So as that bull has progeny that have had measurements recorded by producers for birth weight, for weaning weight, for yearling weight, or production data has been turned in from ultrasound or actual carcass data on the grading process, those numbers will be put back in to the formulas to recalculate these EPDs, and the accuracy number will go up. And then finally, the last number that's expressed in a percentage there is where this animal's EPDs rank within the breed. So for instance, on the Calving direct EPD for this particular bull, his number is plus 16, and that ranks in the top 1% of bulls in the Angus breed. So you won't find very many bulls in the Angus breed that have a better EPD for Calving direct than this guy. Another example is dry matter intake EPD. He's in the 95th percentile for that, which means there's only 5% of the bulls in the breed that he is better than. So that percentile rank tells us quite a bit about this, more so even sometimes than the actual number. I don't know how many times over the years I've had conversations at sales with prospective buyers that they just simply say, well, I need a bull that is going to be low birth so that they can have their calves on their own, and I want them to grow fast. So the only 2 numbers I ever look at are birth weight and yearling weight. And my first reaction is to stop and ask that individual, well, when do you sell your calves, or what is your marketing plan? Well, I sell my calves at weaning. I'm not going to tell you that this yearling weight EPD doesn't have some merit, but if you're selling your calves at weaning, the weaning weight EPD has a lot more to do with your genetic selection than the yearling weight. Yes, they are correlated and both are growth numbers, that typically will both be similar in terms of where that bull ranks in percentage, but we do see from time to time some variation there where it can be ranked higher in weaning than he is in yearling or vice versa. So we need to understand which traits will help us with what our goals are for our particular herd. So this is an example of a really good carcass bull. You can see for the marbling EPD, he's in the top 1%. For ribeye area, he's in the top 1%. He's in the top 15% for fat. And in this case, we want a lower number for fat because that means that he can put in significant marbling with lower external fat and have a higher combination of both quality and yield grades on the rail. And then he's in the top 15% for carcass weight. So this is a bull that is expected to be able to sire calves that can have heavy carcass weights, but still be relatively lean and highly marbled. And that brings me to one other thing in reading these EPDs to understand the difference when we're comparing bulls. So I'm going to advance to the next slide, and I'm just going to use yearling weight as an example here. So this bull has a yearling weight of plus 133. The next slide is an EPD of what we would consider a growth bull. And I guess I forgot to copy and paste his second line of numbers here, but we're looking more at these growth numbers anyway in the weaning and yearling. The previous bull had an EPD of 133 for yearling weight. This bull has an EPD of 141 for yearling weight. So what this means with that 8-pound difference is that on average, you would expect calves out of this second bull to weigh 8 pounds more at yearling time than the bull from the previous screen. And that is the way most of these EPDs can be correlated. Birth weight, for instance, if you're looking at a 0 birth weight versus a bull that has a positive 1 birth weight, you can expect that their calves would have 1 pound on average difference in weight at birth. So it's not a direct number. This doesn't mean that this bull is going to have calves 75 pounds higher at weaning than another bull, unless that other bull's weaning weight EPD is 0. So it's numbers that we can use to compare between the bulls if we understand how to utilize them. But as I said before, these percentages tell us a pretty good story as to where these bulls rank. And if we want to improve the genetic merit of our herd, looking at what traits we need to improve and finding bulls that are in the upper 20 to 30% of the breed for that specific trait are where we want to gravitate to once we identify those traits. Another one to talk about that I mentioned earlier is the milk EPD. And this one here on this growth bull, typically these high growth bulls that have really high rankings for weaning weight and yearling weight will typically have a little bit higher milk number. But what we need to be careful of here is, like I said before, the higher the number is not always necessarily better when looking at milk. Just because that cow has the genetic potential to produce more milk does not mean that we have the proper feed resources to feed her. So if we're the average commercial beef cow herd that is feeding round bales that we baled that are predominantly grass and maybe of questionable quality, hopefully we're utilizing all the other information we've learned at cow-calf schools over the years, and we're matching our feed resources with the time of the year properly. But unless we have really good feed resources with high quality, readily available feed, sometimes this cow will not be able to express that genetic potential to provide all of that feed to her calf and keep herself in good flesh. So a good rule of thumb here for the commercial guy is to stay somewhere near breed average when looking at the milk EPD. So if you're going to try to make genetic selection and improve the carcass numbers in your herd, or improve the carcass quality through genetic selection by utilizing EPDs, you'll want to glance at this milk number and just make sure that you're being realistic and not bringing along a milk number that's in the top 10% of the breed, unless you have the availability of feed resources that can provide for that cow to help her express that. And then you can certainly take advantage of it, and you'll see the increase and added genetic improvement from the other places as well. But just one to keep in mind that we just don't want to stray too far from the average on. Other numbers to look at, I mentioned scrotal circumference. This does have somewhat of a direct correlation with reproductive fertility. So we want to just make sure that we're not too far off of the charts on that as well. And then depending on what genetic selections we want to make within our herd, we want to just look at some additional traits that may help us. And now I've got a third bull pulled up here that what I call is just a more realistic one. If we're looking to make extreme adjustments within our herd for specific traits, we may need to go after a growth bull if that's really where we're missing out, is we have extremely light weaning weights, or in calves that we're keeping in production, light yearling weights, or if we really need to target improved carcass quality, we could go after a bull like this and make selective matings. But in general, if we're going to be in freezer beef production, we need to produce good sound cattle that will grow efficiently and have respectable carcasses at the size that we can market. So here's what I would call a realistic bull, that if you look across his EPD profile, you see numbers anywhere from as high as top 10% in average daily gain, which that would be a good thing for our freezer beef scenario. We've got some 90% ranks. He's in fact 95th percentile on milk production, but 15th in ribeye, 25th percentile in fat, 95th percentile in marbling. So, depending on what specific traits we want to improve the most, this could be a realistic bull. We probably don't like that marbling EPD quite as well if we're selling freezer beef, but depending on what improvement areas we need to focus on and what our finishing type is, we can use these criteria to help us in our selections. And there's, of course, a lot more detail and information we could get into, but we don't have quite that much time here tonight to go through all of that in terms of using these dollar values with dollar maternal, dollar weans, dollar feedlot, dollar grid, dollar beef, and dollar carcass. And not all breeds have all the same indexes like this, but some really good information that we would be glad to discuss with you individually. Myself, Dean, Stan, Garth, any of us certainly could have some great conversation to help you guide all the way through if you want to get down into the nuts and bolts of selecting purebred bulls. When you do go out and select bulls, if you are having thoughts about incorporating multiple breeds within your herd, or just simply looking at switching breeds because we've retained heifers out of an Angus bull for so many years, and now we want to switch gears and we're not going to keep any heifers back. We're going to sell all these calves for freezer beef or sell them at weaning, and we want to switch to a more terminal type bull. This chart here, which is available through most any breed association, or you can find it online through many extension beef websites as well. I don't know if we have a direct link to it on our OSU beef website, but this is one I copied and pasted from the American Angus Association page. And this is a crossbreed EPD adjustments. So if you're comparing two bulls from a different breed to buy, you can't simply look at their EPDs and say, oh, well, this Angus bull had a +1 on birth weight and this Hereford bull had a +4 on birth weight, and think that the Hereford bull is going to be significantly heavier calving. He may be, but you need to use these adjustments because each breed has their own calculations for those. So these crossbreed adjustments have been utilized to help you. So if you are looking at that Angus and Hereford bull, just know, and I know these numbers are hard to see for you guys. It was a lot to copy into one chart, but just here in this birth weight column, all of the Angus EPDs are at a 0, and then the adjustments are made from there. So for a Hereford bull, you need to add 0.8 or 0.8 of a pound to that EPD to get it to compare to the Angus. If you're looking at the weaning weight on a Hereford bull, you need to subtract 14.4 pounds from the Angus if you're comparing those two bulls, so that you can have an accurate assessment then of how they compare and what you might really expect in terms of progeny differences. And then you can use these numbers all the way down the chart for whatever breed you might be looking at. So when we start looking at all this stuff, now we've got this EPD information, we've talked about phenotype. What do we need to do in terms of making these ultimate genetic selection decisions for our herd if we're going to be producing locally raised beef? Well, first and foremost, just keep it simple. For the most part, almost every one of us in our commercial herds in Ohio probably can produce with the average or above, slightly above average bull can produce good freezer beef that is going to satisfy most consumers. But there's always room for improvement. So let's just keep it simple. Select those realistic bulls. Utilize the EPDs if they're available, and make sure, again, we're going back to a reputable. Select a good bull that is good structured, wide-bodied animals that are going to have significant amount of muscle, or at least above average in that case, if we can get it. As I already talked about in the EPDs, we want to be at breed average or slightly below for birth weight and for the milk EPD, and breed average or above for weaning, yearling. And one that I did not talk about that's within the Angus breed is the dollar energy EPD. And that is a correlation to how efficient those animals are in terms of how much money it's going to take to feed them out. And you'll struggle to find very many bulls that'll have a positive number here, but just looking for ones that are on the higher end in terms of those percentages will help you there as well. So what breeds should we be considering? Well, it really depends on your goals. And it may depend somewhat on, again, family history. If your farm is 150 years of Hereford production or of purebred Simmental production, and you know those breeds and you know how to manage the genetic selection within them, we can absolutely make extremely good freezer beef out of any breed we have out there if we know how to feed it and we know how to make those genetic selection improvement decisions. But if we're looking to improve calving knees, to improve feed efficiency, perhaps to moderate overall cow size in our herd, the more maternal breeds such as Angus and Hereford are probably where we're going to want to look to, especially if we're doing natural service. We might want to find an Angus or Hereford bull. If we've got a predominantly maternal based herd that's already mostly Angus and Hereford cows, maybe to produce the ideal freezer beef and take advantage of that hybrid vigor and get the advantage in pounds from that crossbreeding, we probably want to use a more terminal sire from those maternal animals, such as a Charolais, a Limousin, or a Simmental. Or we can even find combination traits from some of those composite breeds that are available today, such as a Sem-Angus bull, a Limflex bull, or even Murray Grey that has already become a composite the way that breed was created to combine some of those traits. And ultimately, we need to be thinking about disposition as well. Can have a big effect on our not only our herd, but we should all know full well if we've been feeding calves for any amount of time, the ones with the higher strung dispositions, that tends to be something that carries on to the progeny. And a lot of times those calves are not going to feed as efficiently. They probably are not going to grade as well and not lead to as ultimately a high quality of experience for our consumer. So back to helping you figure out where we might want to end up in terms of that breed, or in terms of what EPDs we need to select for, or how we want to improve things. What is our marketing plan and what is our herd goal? Are we retaining our own heifers to keep our herd going, or are we going to purchase replacement heifers? How many do we need to keep annually in order to maintain the size of our herd? Typical rule of thumb is 30%. If we have a 100 cow herd, we need to keep 30 females on average per year to maintain that herd size, because we're going to have to deal with culling situations, with getting rid of old cows, open cows, bad feet, bad udders, etc. If we want to expand our herd, we might need to keep or purchase more than that on an annual basis. So stopping to think about, what's it going to cost me if I do keep those heifer calves? Is it worth it for me to make the genetic investment in a specific bull geared towards keeping replacement heifers, or am I better off to not worry about it because it's going to cost me too much to develop those heifers for 2 years before I get a paycheck back out of them, and I should go purchase those heifers? What is the rate of genetic improvement I can expect with some of these decisions? There might be ample opportunity to more quickly increase our genetic improvement with the purchase of either bred females or bred heifers, or at the very least, weaned heifers or yearling heifers from someone else who is in the seed stock business and has more advanced genetic selection already available to us, versus keeping our own and trying to develop those. And then finally, what are opportunity costs? How many bred cows can we keep around versus heifers kept? How many heifers does it take to replace those cows as they age or are culled for another reason? And what is the value of those calves, excuse me, that we don't keep as replacements? How valuable are they to us in that freezer beef operation? And in this case, I would think most of them would have some pretty significant value if that's our ultimate goal, is to continue to grow a freezer beef operation or a calf sale operation to local feeders who are going to try to produce freezer beef. We may have more opportunity to advance our bottom line by selling all those calves rather than worrying about the ones that we're going to keep as replacement females. So let's evaluate our current calf crop as part of that plan and look at our average ratios of how many bulls, how many heifers are we having in a normal year? Are we utilizing AI or is all natural service occurring? And how many are we keeping? How many of the remaining calves are we going to sell versus feed? And who are they going to go to? Ultimately, you know, the consumer in some way, shape, or form. But if it's us directly marketing to the consumer, that might weigh a little bit more heavily in some of our decisions. So figure out where your position is in that supply chain. Are you the one that's ultimately selling that freezer beef, or are you just selling the weaned calves, or are you selling commercial fat cattle to someone else who's going to provide that consumer endpoint? And that's going to have an effect working backwards on what we need to do. So I put together just a little scenario to think about in one way, if we're utilizing AI in our herds, that we might capture some of this genetic advancement. So a real quick to go through, because I know I'm running out of time. If we have a 100 cow herd and we're going to keep 30% replacement, as we already mentioned, we're going to try to AI 100% of that herd for one cycle. So we're going to synchronize, and Dean's going to talk more about that in his talk, but we're going to use one cycle of AI and then turn out a cleanup bull. So if we are going to keep 30% replacement rate, we're going to need to have 35 or 40 heifer calves to choose from to try to get bred to come back into the herd. And we want to market 35 head as freezer beef, with the remaining calves sold to our neighbors that they're going to use for freezer beef, or we're going to take to a sale barn. One opportunity we have through technology today on this is the possibility of using sexed semen to accomplish what our goals are in this genetic advancement. So now we can not only select for some of those traits we talked about, but if we have good production records on our cows and we know who some of our better producing cows are that we would like to continue those genetics in the herd, let's breed those cows to sexed heifer semen so that we can make the absolute best improvement and know that we're going to get heifer calves out of those cows. Take our next 30 cows and breed them to conventional semen, and we're going to hopefully get a 50-50 split. So now I've got 45 heifers to choose from to get my 30 to keep, and we're going to breed the bottom end of our herd to sexed bull semen and have those calves that are going to be more ideal for our feedlot and freezer beef situation. So we're going to breed 30 to sexed heifer semen, 30 to conventional, and 40 to bull semen. And I know some of you are familiar with this technology and probably have utilized it and know there is some added cost. But what is that added cost really? The average premium across, and this is just a quick glance at several of the different beef studs, typically from the pricing, it's about a $30 increase to buy sexed semen. Typically, that's more for the heifer semen versus the bull semen. But if we use $30 and we have a 100 cow herd that we're going to AI 30 of them to sexed heifer semen, it's going to be an increase of $900 on our breeding bill. That sexed bull semen, an extra $10 on average there for an added cost of $400 across those 40 cows that we're going to breed to bull semen. For $1,300 of added money to that one-time AI scenario to get the absolute most marketable calf crop that we could expect is probably a pretty sound investment, considering what we can do with the marketability of having that exact scenario and sex ratio of calves that we want to have to improve that genetic selection. So in closing, a lot of it does come down to dollars and cents, and not the sense that round up to get to that dollar, but common sense. And just thinking through a lot of this stuff of sharpening your pencil, doing your own research, and figuring out the best scenario for your farm. No one knows your feed resources better than you. No one knows your facilities better than you. No one knows your market better than you. Certainly those of us sitting in seats like myself and Garth and Stan and Dean can help you analyze some of these things if you bring the data to us, but you guys know your situation better than anybody. Start by sharpening that pencil and looking at all these costs to figure out exactly what you can do in terms of genetic selection. identify those markets that you have and establish your position in that supply chain, as we talked about, knowing exactly where you need to be in terms of how many calves you can market and how many calves you can sell to your neighbors or sell at the sale barn can help with that decision on how good of a bull you want to buy, whether it's a cleanup or a natural service bull, and then specialize in that position. If it's making calves that you can simply put in a feedlot and you can sell every single calf you have as freezer beef, that's probably your place that you need to specialize and not worry about those replacement females. Go out and purchase those from a reputable breeder. And then finally, negotiate. Everything has an impact and everything's negotiable in this world, whether it's the sale of those calves, whether it's the price of your freezer beef, the price on that sex semen. If you go to your semen supplier and say, hey, I want to do this scenario that was presented to me, I'm going to buy 70 straws of sex semen next year. You can probably get some bulk price discounts and save yourself some money in that way. Same thing with feed purchases, and always making sure that you're flexible and ready to adapt to any changing markets, because we could very quickly go from this high demand of freezer beef that we have today to all of a sudden consumers wanting to go back to the grocery store, and we need to be back as a commercial cow-calf producer sending our cattle to the stockyards where it might pay us the most versus that niche market. And plenty of resources out there for you on the web. Of course, utilize our OSU Beef Team website for a lot of information, and of course, that local producer or that local extension educator or our specialists like Garth that can certainly help you through a lot of these scenarios and figure out the best dollars and cents for your operation. I got any time for questions, Garth?
Yeah, we got a couple here as Dean uploads his slides. We'll just kind of start with the second one. Question was about heritability. Do we know what traits are the most heritable?
We certainly do, and that several hour discussion to have with all the information and data collection capabilities that these breed associations have with gene splicing and typing today. We certainly have a really good idea on what is the most heritable, and that is a discussion that we could go on and on for hours. But for the most part, a lot of these traits are very highly heritable. Obviously, some more than others. If you're looking at any specific trait and want to know those, there's breeding coefficients. If we want to get that far into it, obviously not going to do that in tonight's presentation, but that could be some great one-on-one discussion if someone's got specific questions there that we can help guide them through that scenario. But there definitely is some difference in how heritable some of those traits are versus others. They can have a big impact on helping us make that decision.
And kind of a similar question. This grower's trying to keep live weights under 1,300 pounds. What EPDs should we look at to limit live weight at finishing? Thought about hip height of the bull with the idea that smaller frame bulls produce lighter finished calves.
Yeah, there's definitely some to target in on there. The yearling weight EPD, there's a mature height EPD, and I'm speaking off of the Angus ones. Some of the other breeds have some that are similar and maybe named a little bit different, but mature height would be one of those. Some EPDs are tracked with mature weight. We can also look at in this case, some of those feed efficiency and dollar energy, but a lot of times, and it's not a perfect scenario, but in some cases, the higher the yearling weight EPD, the higher the mature height EPD, and the higher those yearling height records are, that can have an influence there. So those would be the main ones that I would want to key in on is yearling weight, mature height, and then some of the feed efficiency ones to help us to regulate that overall size.